Hello everyone, it's Luke here from 3D Tutor, and today we're back with another complete guide. This one is a special one as we worked on and focused on bringing a grand scale for the environment. It has to be one of the best ones we made so far in regards to the sheer scale within the scene, and not only does it have an entire village on the side of a mountain, it even has a waterfall right in the middle. Before we move on though, if you're interested in how long the scene took and what our thoughts are on how difficult this scene was in regards to putting it all together, then stay till the end and we will give you a complete breakdown of how long each section took and what skill level you might need in each part. The scene comes with its own packed blend file as well as Unreal Engine project, both complete with all the textures and models as you see here. So you can download these assets and try them out yourself. Links to everything are down below, and while you're there, give us a like and hit the subscribe button. The packs are great if you want to see how exactly the scene was put together to help you in any Blender or Unreal Engine projects you may be working on now or in the future. These packs or courses are available via our Gumroad, along with all the YouTube complete guides. Also, anyone that signs up to our Patreon basically gets everything on Gumroad for the price of a cup of coffee, so be sure to check out our Patreon link as well. We have also recently developed a course, a complete dungeon modular kit which allows you to create any type of dungeon from scratch. If you like the sound of that, then check out the link in the description below to see a complete Blender and Unreal Engine 5 online course. Now as for the YouTube, twice a week we release a complete guide just like this one, so be sure to subscribe and hit the bell to get notified of our new uploads. If you want your idea to be featured in one of our complete guides, then drop a comment down below as we'd really love to get some inspiration from you guys. Finally, all of the techniques you see here are covered in our massive library of over 20 courses and 200,000 downloads, so be sure to check those out as well. And now on with the show. What you're here for is the guide, so let's get started on our Blender free Unreal Engine 5 Snow for Fjord scene.
Welcome everyone to the Snow for Fjord modeling section, and this is going to be a long one. So this is where we started off, and the first thing I did is I brought in my human OBJ, as you should always do. Now this, what I've done here is actually combine the modeling and the grey box into one, because I'm not actually showing a lot of the grey box because it's basically going over the same things over and over again, and I don't think that's actually important. I don't think you're going to learn a lot. I mean, you've seen our other actual complete guides and you've seen how we actually create grey boxes. So what we did here though is we started off with a very small grey box, which was just the bridge, the wheel and the little house, and then some chains on the right hand side. And the reason we did that is because we knew that this was a central point for the whole build. And once we've actually got those in there, then we knew that we would actually be able to create the terrain. So sometimes you do a grey box and then you build the terrain around it. Sometimes you build the terrain first, and on this occasion we built a part grey box and then built the terrain. So you can see here, I'm just trying to get some nice shapes in there though. I'm actually taking time to do that, and basically I'm doing that just to make sure that when I look in ZBrush at the image and I check how it's going to look with the silhouette and things like that, then it's going to look good. So that's the reason why I'm just taking that little bit of extra time to make sure that my grey box is looking pretty nice. So here what I want to do is I wanted a bridge, I wanted a wheel, and I wanted it to tell a story. So what I'm trying to do here is actually now create a kind of a shaft that's going to go up and down. I did take a lot of inspiration actually from Game of Thrones when I was actually creating this, as you'll see later on in the build. Obviously that huge wall where they've got actually a lift going up and down, and that's basically where some of the ideas were actually based from. I did want to kind of, World of Warcraft, Howling for Fjord zone type feel, or based around loosely on Vikings or something like that. So there's where my inspiration really came from. So now you can see at the moment I'm just creating a basic chain. I wouldn't normally create chain like this, but as it's just a grey box, I just need to get something in very fast. So that's why I actually did it like that. Normally we use geonodes and things to actually do the chain. So now you can see that what we're doing is just getting in the final parts of the actual mine, because I need to know where the back of the actual lift is going to go up against, because I really don't want to actually go over there when I actually create the terrain. So here I am in ZBrush with a simple sphere. That's what I'm going to start with, and then basically what I'm going to do is use the move tool just to pull that around, and then use the inflate just to inflate it out. I'm using a bit of clay buildup as well, but you can see there with the clay buildup that we're having a few problems there, that when I re-dynamesh it, for instance, sometimes it puts a load of holes in your mesh, and then all you need to do is just press Ctrl Z a couple of times and just go over it again and then re-dynamesh it, and you'll find that actually fixes it. So what I'm trying to do at the moment is just get the basic shape, and I recommend if you're doing your own scene like this, just get, there you go, you could see the actual holes in the mesh appear there. Just get the basic shape, get a really nice silhouette of what you're actually doing, and then build off of that. So you can see now, I use my mask, I flatten that all down because obviously this is going to be water and ice and things like that, so it needs to be flat because obviously water always finds its own level. And now you can see all I'm doing is trying to just build out on what I've actually got now. So I've basically near enough got the basic terrain that I'm actually looking for. So now all it is going over it, making it kind of rocky and things like that. Now also, depending on what actual textures and things like that you're going to be using, bear that in mind when you're actually doing your terrain and things, because you might not actually need to put a load of detail in. So for instance on this, I don't actually need to put a ton of rock detail in because I know that we're going to have snow and things like that, and it's going to cover it, a lot of it up. We still need little, you know, bumps and things like that in the terrain, but most of it will be hidden with snow. So it's always nice as well if you can get it so it's relatively flat where you're going to actually build your houses on and things like that, because if not, it's going to make it hard work in the long run. So you can see here I'm actually creating now where the actual waterfall is going to come over. Normally at the edge of the waterfall, because it's been eroded by time, you're going to have lots of bumps and things like that right on the edge there, and it does really create a realistic kind of environment when you've got your waterfall going over, and you can see some little rocks underneath and things like that. So now what I'm doing is I'm just pulling it out now. I've checked my silhouette, I'm making sure I've got the right size, and now I'm just going over those parts where I've actually masked it, because you can see obviously it's stretched and things like that, going over it again, and then I'm going to re-dynamesh it. Alright, so you can see it was a relatively quick process to create the actual terrain, far quicker than actually building the whole of the sea now, which took, I think it took around 8 hours. It was probably the longest one we've done so far. Pretty long scene, and now I decided to, you know, give them some extra spikes on those mountains, and then all I did was I went in and decimated it. Now I've got my terrain in, I can come back now, and you can see we've put a load of grey box in there, as you can see. Really just basic cubes and things like that, just some real basic trees and things, and now I'm actually going to come in and actually work on actually getting the feel of the environment that I want. So as I say, a lot of this is based on Vikings, Valkyries, Howling for Fjord Zone, things like that. That's the main part of it at least, and that's what I'm actually going to do now. I was going to actually have this bridge actually curved slightly, but in the end I don't think I actually curved it. I think I kept it straight because it actually looked you know, it looked better that way. So now when you're building a bridge, it's important that you build it structurally sound. So you can see I'm really taking some time, first of all, to make sure that the planks look pretty realistic. Now you can use textures to make your planks, and sometimes that's good, but in something like this, because there's lots and lots of different parts, probably better off just making the planks as I'm doing here. So what I'm doing is I'm actually using that seam to basically split up these planks when I need to. So then I can just grab them, I can push them in then, and now I'm just using random with proportional editing, and then finally just pulling each one of those out to make them very different. Then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mirror them over to the other side, and I know I can get away with that because obviously you can't see two sides at once, so you'll never be able to see that, hey, these are the same or anything like that. Now the most important bit is working on what I've just spoke about, making this bridge structurally sound. It needs to look as though it's strong enough to weather, you know, snow and things like that, because there's a lot of weight on things when you know, there's snow and ice on them. And the other drawback is we're not building with concrete here, so we're building with timber, we're building with metal, and we need to keep to those actual materials. Okay, so now we're just putting more struts in, and I'm just keep building and building and building on what I've got before finally I can actually bring in that walkway and pull it all together. So this was probably, because it's the central point of the actual scene, because this is where the water runs under and the wheels there and everything like that, you need to make sure that you take probably a little bit of extra time on those parts. So generally, the closer the camera's going to be, or the more visible something's going to be, that's where you should actually put the most amount of time in. Of course, if we did the same thing right around this scene, it would have took something like 20 something hours or something like that. And now what you can see is we're working on how do we actually put this bridge to the edge. Basically, how do we give it an edge? How do we attach it to the actual other parts? And the great way of doing that is actually putting up a barrier there, you know, as though people are looking over into the you know, the river and ice and things like that, and that also will enable us then to actually put this over and attach it to our actual wall and things. So now you can see I'm just joining it all up, and now I'm actually going to bevel it all off, because we always bevel things off because things normally aren't actually razor sharp in real life or anything like that, so that's why we're actually doing that. And now adding in some more supports, as I say, trying to make sure it's structurally sound, giving it a lot of supports, making sure that this bridge looks like it's going to stand, you know, the test of time and things like that. And again, you can just see how long the actual bridge actually took to put in, and finally now it's finished and I'm able to put it in place in the right place. And now it's time to actually, I think, bring in some textures and things like that. And the reason I bring in some basic textures is because it gives you a really good visual of what things are actually going to look like once we've got it into Unreal. Gives an idea of silhouette, shadows, things like that. And you can see there now, because I brought that water in, you can really see what else needs to be done. For instance, on those supports at the bottom, you need to kind of put those in as though this bridge is going to be supported. And the way I did it was I put it right at the edge where the waterfall goes over and put in some metal and some really big chunky kind of bolts and things like that. So that's what I'm actually going to do now. I did know that some of this obviously is going to need to be stone, not all of it's going to be wood. So what I did there, I actually went into another blend file where I've actually got a modifier stack of actual stylized stone that I've created, and then I just appended that in, and now you can see they look much better as the wood's actually coming out of there. It really would actually support the weight of the flowing river and things like that. So now I'm putting in the big bolts. I'm moving them up and down just to make sure they're randomized so they're not all looking the same, and then I'm checking the water and things like that. Now we're actually moving on to the actual wheel, and I've made a lot of wheels and I've kind of got a really nice technique nailed down actually, where I'm going to use an empty and I'm basically going to array those actual paddles going around. You can see to start with, I just thought, well, I'll just split them up and bring them in and do it that way. But I knew if I did that, I wouldn't actually be able to, you know, change them individually. So better off to bring in an empty, as I'm doing here, use an array system, turn up the amount, and then turn it just so they kind of come together like so. And now you can see that when I actually modify one of them, I modify them all, and that's what makes it so powerful with the array. Now I'm bringing in the inside, and again, I'm thinking, right, how should I do the inside? Again, I use that same array there. As you can see, I just joined it to my actual paddles just to make those nice bolts, because I know each one of those is going to have to be bolted in pretty hard because of the fact the river's flowing and it's going to be pushing really hard against that. Now with the inside of there, you can see that I just did a bit of math, worked out how many I'm going to need, and I simply just I'm not sure if I arrayed them round. Yes, I did. I arrayed them round again to how many I'm going to need. So, and now you can see I'm adding supports, and I can do all that with the array, and that just made it so easy to actually create this. So if you're doing anything like this, use an array with an empty, and it just makes the job really easy. Again, now we're adding in some materials just to get a feel of what it's going to look like. And also this is great because when then Luke sends it through to Substance Paint or anything like that, all the materials are basically named and all on there, so he knows basically what needs what material. So that's why it's another good idea to do that. You don't get confused or anything. Now I'm actually starting on the first roof, and the first roof is always the hardest, and the reason is you need to kind of make sure it all comes together in the same style. And your first roof really will determine how the rest of the build is going to actually look, so just bear that in mind. You can see here as well, I'm erring on the chunky side of things. I want it to be kind of a little bit stylized, a little bit like World of Warcraft, that's kind of stylized look. A little bit less of ESO basically is what I'm saying, like the medieval dungeon or the Skyrim guide that we did. I wanted this to be a little bit less realistic and a little bit more stylized, so that's what I'm working on. Again, with the actual planks, I decided instead of bringing in a texture, I'm going to make them individually, just to make them stand out a little bit more, because we're not so concerned with polygon count on this either. We're just trying to make a good scene and show all of you how we actually put it together, the different techniques that we actually used. So if this is a little bit too fast, just download the video and basically slow it down, or you could even slow it down within YouTube itself. We also have the actual modular kit available as well to download from our Gumroad, so if you actually get that, you'll be able to see exactly how everything's put together. Alright, so as you can see, this actual house, it's going to have a lot of weight to it. It's also holding a big wheel. So again, when we're talking about something being structurally sound, it's better if we think about how is it going to be placed right on the edge of the actual cliff basically. So that's why we're putting all of that rocking, looking as though it's all been, you know, hammered out and things like that. And then this house has actually been built upon it. And now I've got to work out is what's holding this in place, because normally you wouldn't have just a big massive block of you know, stone like that. Normally it would be broke up into little pieces. So a way around that is just to, you know, add some planks of wood in between them, and then it looks like it's actually, you know, it could be in pieces like so. So they've just come along with, you know, a meter piece or something rather than an 800-ton block or something. If it was something like the Egyptians or Aztecs, then yeah, maybe we could get away with that. But something like you know, this, which is loosely based on Vikings, then I don't think they had the technology to move around blocks like that. Again, it's the same technique that I'm using every time, where I'm just marking seams, splitting up those planks, using proportional editing with randomize, and then just pulling them out a little bit. And you can see it's just a great way to get a really nice looking planks and things like that. Now, if I was edging more on realism, or if I had more time, what I would really do is take these planks, these big pieces of wood, mark the edges off, things like that, bend them crooked and all stuff like that, and it really would add a lot to the scene, but it would also add a lot to the actual time, so that's why we didn't actually do that. The other thing is, because it's a basic grey box, you've also got a lot of planning also to do, even though there's a grey box there, mainly with supports and things, because on the grey box we don't actually consider anything like that. It's just basically getting a nice silhouette, getting the shapes of things in place and where things are going to go, and then you've got to go in and really think about, right, how is this building going to go together? And this is a time actually to do a little bit of experimentation as well. I wouldn't do the experimentation in the grey box. I'd always leave it till, you know, this stage of the actual build. Now, because this one is such an actual long scene, I can't possibly talk about every single bit that we've done, so I'm hoping a lot of the things you can see exactly what we're doing and how we actually put it together. It's basically mainly using edge loops, and whenever you finish the piece, just beveling them off, and then using a few technical you know, ways of modifiers to array things and things like that. Now I'm looking for is actually sorting out, I think I'm actually looking to sort out my actual icebergs and things like that. Oh, I'm actually doing the backdrop, there we go. I'm bringing in a HDRI, and the HDRI, which you can get, by the way, from, again, our Gumroad or all our courses, pretty much have got the HDRI comes with them, where you can actually have a gradient and still keep that actual realistic lighting. In other words, you can swap out the HDRI for something like a sunset, and then that lighting will stay there, and then you can actually change the gradient for the background, which is really, really nice with something like this. A lot of the time when you're bringing in your own HDRI, you'll have problems where, you know, it'll have buildings in the background, or you know, rivers and things like that, and they just don't go well. So this actually gets around that. Again, now I'm looking, just having a look. Always keep taking a step back, having a look at how it's coming along, and then just carry on from there. You can see I'm just making some simple icebergs now, getting those into place, because I know once I've got those into place, it's actually going to give me a much better understanding what the scene's going to look like, because basically we want a nice shot of that cave with some ice kind of coming down, and the icebergs where the bridge is partly stuck in the icebergs as though it's just starting to thaw out. That's the kind of look we're actually going for. So once we've got these in place, we've got our water in place, then we can start bringing this all together. As you can see here, the icicles, that's what I'm actually working on now. Clay build up, move tool, smooth them off, a bit of clay as well, that's what I'm using there, and then some trim dynamic, and you can see the effect that you get. It's looking pretty nice. Again, the texture will do a lot of work on these, so I'm not too concerned about that. And I know I wanted 3 in there, and I want them to look different, and I want them basically going in different sizes and things. Now I'm just decimating them all down, because they're way too high on the polygons, bringing them in now, fixing any problems with the actual faces, as you can see there. And now working on bringing in a really, you know, nice material, and you can see that that material looks really nice. And now I can actually put them into place in the cave, and I can use that material on my actual iceberg. So working on it a little bit more now. I've got my lighting in, and there you go. So now what I'm doing is I'm actually working out how many buildings I'm going to need. So I don't want every building looking the same, but I don't want to actually create a load of work for myself. So what I really want to do is create one type of roof and then build off that with every other one. So here is the first roof that I'm actually building. I was going to make this actually a modular kit, but the problem is with a build like this, there's so many steps and kind of planks and things, it does make it very difficult. Now you could actually you know, create 3, 4, 5 different houses. You could absolutely do that, but the actual planks and things, they're not going to work as a modular system because there's simply too many for something like this. So if I was building this out, let's say in Unreal, and I wanted the ability to build a massive kind of level or something, what I would do is probably create like 10 different planks, get them all textured up and things like that, and then I could use those over and over again, and I could actually change the size and things like that. So you can see here what I'm working on. I'm trying to keep the same style as the rest of the build, and I'm trying to also think about how many different variations of the houses we can have, so how to make them look different but still the same. It's always good when you put on this kind of outhouse thing here, like you can see, because that then can be moved left and right or up and down and make buildings look different from each other. So there's the first one, as you can see. And now I've took that to the side again because I know I could reuse that if I need to. And now I'm thinking of, okay, we've got the top, let's do the bottom. And again, we need to make sure it all fits together so it's consistent right across the scene. And again, I'm going to use the bottom with the rest of the build, so I'm creating different tops and different bottoms and mixing them up basically. I think I created 3 or 4 different ones. It wasn't a lot of different ones, and it wasn't actually that time consuming. The main time consuming thing in this build is trying to bring it all together and make sure that we're building around our terrain. You've got to make sure that when you've actually put these houses in, they need to make sure as though they're all secured against the rocks and things like that. And that is the hardest part basically. So now I'm actually coming in and populating the scene with the different houses, seeing where everything can go, pulling them out. Don't be afraid to pull, things out. They will look a little bit different once you do that. You can see now we've got a couple of variations on our houses. And now it's time to just make some basic trees. And the reason I do that is, again, it's down to the silhouette. You get a much better, vision of what everything's going to look like if you've got a few trees in there and things like that. And now it's on to actually giving our, terrain something to actually work with. And this also is good for Luke when I pass it on to him in Substance Painter, because it gives him a good visualization of what I'm actually going for here. I mean, if you think about it, this actual scene could be a really nice sunny hot day, it could be a really snowy environment, it could be really raining, many different things. But giving Luke the vision that I'm going for is because we don't actually have someone to do concept art or something like that. So basically it's modeled with a grey box, and we have to give another person the vision from the actual grey box. So basically adding in things like, simple textures and materials really actually gives them the idea of what we're actually going for. So again here, because these are stuck in the side of the actual cliff, we need to make sure that they are very secure. I mean, we don't want the actual house falling off the cliff. We don't want it looking to be too, nimble or anything like that. So it needs to look solid. The whole build needs to look like it's really rugged and ready to, fit in with this actual environment. We're not actually too concerned though with health and safety. As you can see there, we've got a lot of gaps and things like that. I don't think the people who ever live here would be too concerned with that. So that's one good thing that we can actually get away with in a kind of stylized build like this. So now I'm just making the first steps, and basically from here I'm going to use these steps that I've created in a lot of time. So I need to make sure that they look right. I'm going to leave the bevel. I'm not actually going to apply it yet. I'm going to apply it after, once I've actually created a few of these steps. It's going to make it easier to do it in that way. Now I'm creating kind of these ground steps. And you can see that I'm having to add in a lot of extra planks here where they need to go to basically build it round the terrain that we've actually done. But you can see that if we built this out first and then built our terrain around it, it probably would have been a harder process to do it like that. Alright, so now I think we're going to start work on the tower, is it? Yes, we're going to start work on the actual tower. So this is kind of a lookout post in case they're attacked and things like that, or a place for storage like grains and things. So the one thing about the tower is we need to make sure that obviously you need someone on there who's manning them. So we need to make sure that we bring our guy over and make sure that he's actually, make sure it's the right height and things like that. And that's what I'm going to do in a minute. So you can see, bring my guy in here. And now we're just going to kind of pull it all together, and again making it all structurally sound and things like that. Because I mean, that weight on the top of it, it's a fair amount of weight, so we need to make sure that it's held in place correctly. You can see there as well, I'm trying to make a little bit of variations. Again, I'm experimenting and seeing how it's going to look. You can see there how I put those posts around. I grab that central plane, Shift S, move your cursor to it, and then press the little sideways V on your keyboard. And what that'll do is, it'll make sure that when you actually duplicate something, press Alt Z to move it on the Z axis, it will go around the actual cursor in a circle. So that's how we're doing all of this actual tower there. Alright, so we're nearly complete with the tower. We're just putting the bottom parts on now, and then we'll be putting some materials on it and getting it into place. And basically, I think we've got just one more building to actually create after that. And the other ones, I think I'm just going to use the same ones and just vary them up a little bit. And I'm trying to keep the actual color scheme and the materials consistent as well. For instance, the roof. The reason why they would be different wood is because they have been open to the elements, so they're constantly getting hammered with the snow and things like that. So they probably in all likelihood would be a different color because the actual snow is settling on them. And these are things that you need to take into consideration when you're actually putting materials on and things like that. I think Luke, when we first started painting it and stuff, he actually left the planks up the same as the wood around the houses, and they just look so much better when we actually change that out for darker wood, basically. Again, with the proportion editing, the randomize, and I think this is, it's another actual house. So this is the actual last house that I'm building. You can see here, I'm taking the time as well to make it very different from the other houses, which I think is important. I think if we had them all looking the same, the scene wouldn't look nowhere near as good. So basically total houses is going to be 5, I think, something like that. So not too many, and you can also see that they're very simple because we are letting the actual scene and the textures do a lot of the kind of work for us. You can see though as well that we're not taking anything into ZBrush. We're not actually making the edges and things like that, roughing them all up or anything. We're not bending a lot of planks, so we have kept it actually quite low poly and very simple. And you can see you can get a really amazing looking scene with very limited modeling skills actually. Alright, so I put a house over there, I duplicate it out, and then I bring it in and put that house. So you can see all of this side now looks very different from each other. And now this is, I think we're moving to the hard bit now, which is pulling everything together. It's the hardest part, making sure that everything fits in and making sure that, if anybody's looking at the scene from any angle, it looks solid. It looks as though, all of the parts won't be falling over or anything like that. And yeah, this took the longest amount of time, because you can see that part over there in the corner, it's a weird shape. It took a bit of time to get it, coming all together. So, and that's also why I'm bouncing around as well. You can see I'm bouncing around between different sections, and I do that a lot because then while I'm actually building up this section over here, I'm thinking about that section over there at the same time, which then is, when I come back to it, then it's like, you sometimes have eureka moments where I know how to do that now. I know how I'm going to build that, and you get that by just go to a different part of the scene, start on that part, and then come back to it. You can see I'm also pausing a lot as well, and what I'm looking at when I'm pausing most of the time is looking again at the silhouette, how everything's going to come together, and looking at different angles and things like that. Again, with the planks of wood, the snow is going to be covering a lot, so it's going to do a lot of the work for you. So just make sure though that the terrain is not too low down, because obviously you're going to bring snow on it. So just make sure it's the right height. Now the good thing is about that modifier stack that I'm using there with the actual rocks and things is that you can basically take a copy of it, and once you've actually reset the transformations, it'll look completely different from the other rocks. So that's really good. It gives some randomness to it as well. So you basically pull it out, you press Ctrl A to reset transformations, and then you can basically add in edge loops and things like that to make it longer. So it's really good technique to learn modifier stacking. Alright, so now you can see what I'm doing is I'm just trying to get this house, because you can see it's right on the edge of the cliff there. There's very little holding it in place, so I knew that it's going to need a lot of supports to actually hold that in place. I could have made this easy on myself and actually brought that terrain up right under the house, but it's not going to look as realistic, it's not going to look as organic, and the scene's going to look a lot better doing it this way. Now there was a part where you can see the higher I go up here, I've got to bend it kind of around the house, and the other thing is as well that to get up to that top one, there's no way the steps are actually going to go around there, and I knew that, so I knew the only way to actually get around that is they're going to probably need a ladder to get up to that top one, which again is adding some variation. So again, I didn't mind that. Now you can see here, it's quite hard. We've got to fit some steps right on top of that roof, so you've got to make sure that they look realistic. And here we go, you can see there that I'm thinking, yeah, we can't really get some steps up there. It means if I put some steps up there, it's going to pull this right outwards. Like they're going to have to go right out to actually come into this house, so that's not going to work very well. So you can see I just put a barrier there, and then I'm going to come over and actually create some ladders actually leading up to it. Before I do that though, obviously I'm going to make sure everything's secure, everything's in place, and this house ain't going to fall over. So now, as you can see with this part here, it's just a lot of basically putting a lot of planks in, a lot of posts, things like that, and really bringing all that bit together. As I said, this part was the hardest part, and now you can see I'm actually creating that ladder. Very simple ladder. I know it didn't need much, so just an array, 2 cubes basically, bevel the tops off, and then we can put it in place like so. Alright, so now actually it's time to move on to the other side. So because we've done the first side, the other side is a bit of a breeze actually, except 2 parts, which are the actual shaft going down, basically going down to the river where they're doing some mining or something like that, and also the fishing hut, which you'll see. Probably not notice the fishing hut yet, but you will notice it as we start building it out. The actual fishing line, you're probably going to want to watch that, because it's a very good technique to do anything like that really. So you can see I'm still using the house to put it in there. It's just the fact that we have to build it out. It's a very awkward position where the actual fishing hut is. You can see as well I'm not actually worried about pulling the terrain up or anything like that if it just simply won't fit. So here we are on the actual shaft, and you can see now I'm just pulling out the terrain, just making it fit around. I've got my lift there that's going to go up and down, and basically I'm going to first of all build out this crane, and then I'm going to basically use a geonode to create the actual rope, which you'll see in a minute. And the reason I'm using a geonode is because it gives me, it's very adaptable on the fly, which means I've not got to commit to something. I can actually change the, the scale of my rope, how many rings it's got, things like that, how thick it is. And we have got a video as well on the channel showing you how to create this this rope or chain using geonodes. Alright, again I'm using my guide just to make sure everything's going to fit with the scale, the size of the lift, and again I took a lot of inspiration from Game of Thrones when I was actually creating this lift. Of course, the other odd part about this lift shaft, it needs to fit perfectly with the actual bridge, and that's why we actually did the terrain and we did the grey box, just to make sure it's actually going to all come together. So now here is the actual lift that I'm creating. You can see there I used the grease pencil basically to draw that curve actually in, and now it gives me a lot of ability to move them out and make them as low or high poly as whatever I want. I'm still going for that actual Viking theme, as you can see here, and that's why we made it look that way. It would obviously be made of some sort of metal, but mainly out of wood, because if you made those ends like out of metal, it just would be way too heavy for this sort of era basically. So that's why we used this wood instead. And plus with wood, it gives you a lot more ability to make things a lot more ornate and things. Alright, so now you can see this is where I bring in another geonode with the actual rope, and you can see there I can really alter this and change the dimensions of the rope and things like that. And it's really easy then to pull it all together, because you just basically bring in a curve, add on this geometry node, and there you go. Then you can make the rest of the rope as well the same sort of scale and things like that, and it can really look nice, and it's really quick to actually do. You can see there I brought in, I'm not sure if I missed that actually. I don't know if I brought in a torus or if I brought in a curve. I think I brought in a curve because I'd normally work with curves like that. So you can see I need a bit of a knot on there, so I need to put something on there. So I'll just use a piece of metal rather than make some more rope actually going around it. Probably a bit too much with the rope anyway. Alright, so now you can see him bring the rope up, pulling it out into place. It needs to go in there. Having a little bit of trouble actually with this, so I think actually I went in and just restarted it. Sometimes you need to do that because if it just won't go right, then better off. There you go, just restart it. Throw in another one. It just made it so much easier rather than messing around with the piece of rope that I had, because unfortunately I think when I brought that rope in, well, the curve, I'd actually pulled it out in a weird direction. It just didn't go right. Yeah, and there we go. There's the new curve that I brought in. And you can see, as soon as I brought that in, then it all fitted together, and then it was easy. It was the curve that was causing me all those problems, so sometimes better off just to start again with something like that. Alright, so we've nearly actually finished the actual crane. I was thinking about animating this, and in the end we didn't actually animate this, but it would be relatively easy to animate. The only problem you'd have is with the actual rope, you need to make it kind of disappear and get thinner and things like that, which isn't that hard to do in Blender. A little bit more tricky to do in Unreal, but in the end I didn't do it. I think I forgot about it or ran out of time, so that's the only reason we didn't do that. We did actually animate the actual wheel, of course, and the river and things like that, and the snow, of course. So I think there was enough actually in this scene. Honestly, with this scene, we could have carried on and on and on, and it would have got better and better. It was such a beautiful scene to actually create. So, but you need to have a cut-off point of how long you're actually going to spend on something. And if we had done that as well, then this video would have been 3 hours long, and that's something else we have to really take into account. We want to show you guys how we do something, but we don't want it to be over 3 hours. I'm sure many of you just wouldn't watch it if it was that long, so we try and keep them around an hour and 10, something like that. Because a lot of this as well is, you know, you gain a lot of ideas of how to bring a scene together, but a lot of the actual modeling is actually rinse and repeat. So once you see the techniques we can use, you can go ahead and use them yourself. And then you can see how we pulled the scene together, where we started from, how we ended up where we did. And then you can go on and look at how we textured it and how we brought it into Unreal and did the snow and all things like that. Alright, so we're coming now to basically near enough the final parts of the build. So I want this actual, this part of the building just look a bit different. After all, it should look a bit different because it's part of the, you know, the shaft that takes the lift up and down. So I wanted it to be different. Yeah, and I think using, you know, a lot of the modular parts I already had to do that, I think it's come together really, really well. Alright, so now what's left is I need to go in and put in those floors, and then finally I can come round to the fishing hut and make that fishing line and the little bob that goes into the actual water down below. Again, we've just got to work around the terrain. As you can see, I'm moving it out a little bit because this bit is a little bit tricky. Getting those steps going down, as you can see. Just trying to work out best way to do this. And I'm thinking, I'll come to that other bit later. You can see those steps going up that I'm not. Again, it's one of those where I'm moving around and thinking, how am I going to do that while doing something else? Yeah, I'm going to start on the fishing line now. So this is the really easy way to create a fishing line. So using simple deform, giving it lots of edge loops to actually get a real nice bend on it. Make sure, of course, it all fits in place. And then we're going to need a line as well to finish it off. So I think there'd be a little bit more support than what I actually put in. So you can see that I'm kind of winging how it's actually supported there, but actually it looks pretty nice. So, alright, so let's now I think start on the actual fishing line. So you can see, before I do that though, I've got to make sure that there's, you know, a place for the actual line to go. So while I've not applied my simple deform, I can actually come in and pull out these edges, and then it'll obviously you know, the actual modifier will deform that as well. So here we are with the actual curve, and we just bend it now into all of those holes that are going to be there for the fishing line, straighten it all up, and then what we'll do is we'll bring out the depth, and then we'll press Alt-S on certain parts to make that fishing line a little bit smaller. And the good thing is about this, as you can see, if I press EZ and actually extrude that straight down as I've done there, it's like perfectly straight, and that's probably what you're going to want it as. Bring it straight down, and I can put my little bobble on the bottom of it. And there you go, it was as simple as that actually to create that fishing line. Now, the other hard bit is basically getting the steps right, as you can see. So getting those in, as though we can actually walk up it. I think, again, I actually winged it a little bit on this bit. I actually pulled up the terrain just to make it a little bit easier for myself. And the final part is, I need to make sure then that all of that actual fishing up is really, really nice and secure. And there we go, the last few bits. I was like, finally, this is looking really nice. Took a lot of work to put it together, but it's really come together nice. And you know you're on the home straight when you're fixing these bits now. It was actually quite tricky, this part, because again, most of this building is actually leaning over. It would be probably like that because obviously it's very hard to fish anywhere. You won't want to be going down near the ice, so you probably would be fishing from here. It would make it much easier. I mean, there's a cave down there, there's a river down there, so you're probably not going to get a boat down there realistically. So yeah, I imagine this would probably be the way that they would do it. As you can see, I'm using the metal blocks on there, not the actual stone, because I need something a little bit more robust, I think. And now finally just the last planks going in. And then what I'll do is I'll make sure everything's got materials on, do a final check on everything, make sure everything's beveled off, which it should be. Have a quick look now to see what it's actually going to look like, and there we go. That is the final part of the modelling part of the Snow Fjord, or Ford as some people call him. And you can see it looks really, really nice, and it came together really well from the vision of our grey box, bringing in the terrain and things like that. Alright everyone, so that's that. I hope you enjoyed it. Happy modelling, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.
Alright, now in order to start my texturing process, I firstly opened up the Substance Painter and began testing my texture density within the assets. And for me, the easiest way that I find doing it is by simply applying a type of material that has a lot of detail within it, and then using triplanar projection in order to see if the material is going to be applied in the same kind of way. And what I realized is that within some of the meshes, for some reason, some of the UV faces were not projecting properly onto the texture map. And so what I had to do was I had to go into Blender, delete the texture map information, and basically redo the UV chunks. But that was an easy fix. I'm not sure why exactly that happens. I think there's a small bug within Blender itself when merging items together or something of the sort, and you won't notice that until you go into the texturing process itself. So anyway, by just grabbing the UV map and deleting it and then reorganizing the UV coordinates, I was able to fix that issue. And then while doing so, I also realized that some of the normal maps were flipped within certain areas. So I went in and quickly just chucked over the entire map and flipped the normals where necessary, because otherwise what happens is when you're doing work outside of Blender is that you'll see the inside of a mesh and it'll look really weird, and that'll cause us some issues, especially when generating mesh maps. So we got to make sure that all of the faces are facing outwards and we're able to get the right kind of results. But anyway, once I had that sorted, I was just making sure that all of them are sorted out properly, and I was still trying to figure out at that point what is going on with my mesh and why for the house framework I wasn't able to get any type of a texture detail within it. But yeah, once I got that out of the way, I ended up starting my texturing process using a dirt and just getting the soil out of the way first, just to help me visualize the overall kind of a scene and the structure for the houses. So I'm using a Starlight texture that I had previously set up, and it's just a simple soil texture that has some curvature maps. But what I realized was I don't actually have any of the baked mesh maps sorted yet, so I ended up just baking them out right away, as otherwise all of our generated smart materials wouldn't be able to work without them. So once I got those out of the way, played around with some of the settings, tweaked some of the values, and made sure that none of the textures seems like it's just a repetitive sort of a texture. But I made sure to overlap certain masks as well and kind of get more of the variation out of this entire texture. But at that point, I wasn't too worried about how it'll turn out, because I knew that I'll be adding a snow, and once I started playing with the snow, I realized that it's going to look quite nicely. While painting a snow though, because it's a separate texture, it's going to apply all of the height map information on top of the dirt, and it's going to give us a really noisy type of result. So what we have to do is we have to go onto the height channel and make sure we set it to a normal blending mode, as otherwise they won't be overlaying properly and it'll just give you a messy type of result. But yeah, once I was happy with that, I went back in and painted around some of the edges as well. I also made sure to make use out of the ambient occlusion a little bit. We could cover all of the areas for where it's close to the houses, as the snow would usually be piling up closer to those kind of places, since it wouldn't be blown away by the wind. So once I was happy with that, I continued my texturing process. This time I went in and straight up started doing the texturing for the bridge, as that was basically kind of a cornerstone of this entire asset. It was right in the middle of our environment, so it's going to be quite noticeable in that area. So what I ended up doing is I ended up grabbing two variations of wood. Both of them are of the same material, so it uses pretty much the basics of the Substance Painter and has a nice grain, and it simply overlays all the texture values using generated masks to get a nice kind of a highlight for the edges, as well as in general just a nice color variation. So once I was happy with that, I realized that for the bridge I was getting softened up edges, and I kind of forgot to turn off the auto smooth when I was exporting them out. After I was done fixing all of the mesh up, I made sure that the smooth shading is turned on, and then with it I made sure that the smooth shading is turned on, and then basically used automatic smoothing. So once I exported out my FBX that was identical to the previous one, I went back onto the Substance, clicked on edit, and then from the project configurations I switched out the FBX file, and that just simply recomputed all of my assets. And because I had the same UV coordinates for them, I didn't have to go back onto the texture set settings and rebake out my texture maps for them, as usually when you change out your mesh you have to do that in order to generate the right type of texture maps. So anyway, once I got back into the texturing part, I continued on the texturing process, this time for the metal, and I wanted to get a simple yet stylized looking metal, so got myself a stylized smart material that I had previously, and it has some generated masks that give some nice edge wear as well as some nice tint within it. And once I was happy with that, I realized that for the bottom pieces they have to look more rusty because they're going to be submerged in the water. So I ended up getting some rust grunge mask and simply applying onto the bottom sections of the metal areas. So once I was happy with the bridge, I ended up just making use out of the same materials that I previously made. Because they're small materials, they're using mesh masks, and so we're able to make use out of them in a really fast kind of way and get some really nice results. But with this modeling process, what took probably the most time to texture this entire asset was simply masking out all of our areas. Because I wasn't using any of modular pieces to get this environment done, and all of the assets were actually its own separate model pieces, that means that every texture had to be applied onto each one of the assets independently. So the masking process took a really long time. But anyways, when I was doing the wall bits for the sides of the houses, I was trying to think of what I can do in order for it to stand out a little bit more. And at first I was actually thinking about using something like concrete or stone for the edge of the walls, as it would give some nice detail. But I realized that within this area it wouldn't look quite as well, as the entire terrain already is quite lowly saturated and it wouldn't stand out from the overall kind of a scene setup. So I ended up using a nice stylized wood texture that I had, and it had just the right type of grain that it would highlight the edges of those houses. So I was quite happy with the way it turned out. It had a It had a rough type of look which definitely fits nicely towards the scene, as well as some of the more overly exaggerated detail that definitely makes it look more stylish. So I think all in all it fit in quite nicely. I just had to make sure I not overdo with the color, so what I did was I got myself some overlays that desaturates as well as darkens the overall texture, and in turn I definitely think it blends in more with the overall style for the scene. But yeah, once I was happy with the overall texture for the edge of the walls, I ended up doing some texturing for the ropes as well. And the ropes simply use a nice stripy pattern that gives it a more of a fiber look to them. But in order to get some variation out of them, I had to make sure I create two separate materials and kind of overlay with one another. And in both of these variations, they would have a slight different tint for the color. This way, the overall shape for the rope would just make it look like it pops out a little bit more. So yeah, once I got the texture for the rope sorted, I ended up continuing my texturing process with the other larger pieces of the assets that I had within my environment. So this one was next to the bridge, the watermill house, and I tried at the very start to get it to be a wooden type of a watermill that just completely uses wood, but I didn't quite like the way the grain ends up going, and I wasn't quite sure that it would look differently if I had any type of different UV maps for them as well, as in general it just didn't look like it would fit quite the right type of theme. We do use some metal on the edges of the bridge, and I think I just wanted to make it stand out a little bit more, so using a different type of material I think definitely helped with that. But moving on, I went on and continued the texturing process for the fishing hut as well. That's right above the cliff. I really like the way the overall design turned out to be, as it's just hanging on the side of the terrain right in the middle of the entire center, but yet it's still quite isolated looking of an area, so I really like the way it turned out to be. And just the fishing rod itself, it kind of helps to break down the edges for this overall middle section of the cliff. So all in all, it definitely looked quite nice. I just wanted to make sure it stands out nicely, so I made sure to just highlight some of the areas a little bit more using some of that curvature masking. While texturing though, I had some artifacts, so I just went back into Blender and kind of fixed that up real quick, and then just re-imported back my mesh and continued on with the workflow. Also, when I was texturing the roof, I realized that the grain for the roof wasn't actually going out in the same kind of direction too. So as an easy fix, what I ended up doing was I ended up just getting myself a projection from the top and projecting the overall grain of that wood so it would go in the same kind of direction. I didn't have that sort of a issue for the other areas. It only happened for this one. So it just ends up slowing down the process. And the downside of it as well is that because the pattern is overlaid, it doesn't look like each of the planks are unique in that regard. So we have to make sure we position it properly, the overall pattern, and try to avoid that similarity looking grain that would go on multiple planks at once. But yeah, once I was happy with that, I continued working on the smaller pieces of the town and getting all of the detail right during this process. Because all of the assets were unique and they all were placed in the different areas within terrain, I was getting different results for the generated material maps, and that is because the ambient occlusion as well as the curvature masks were being baked differently within those areas. It all depended on how close the meshes were one to each other and where they're located at, and because of that, some of the areas were darker within my texture. So I basically went back into the texture every time I finished up the masking process. I ended up just tweaking some values, just making sure that I was getting overall type of shapes to look in the same kind of manner as I did for the previous houses, just to keep that consistency throughout the entire environment. Also, during the texturing process at the very start, when I was doing the bridge, I needed to do some texturing for the rocks as well. So in order for me to texture those, I ended up just getting a simple concrete for the overall noise of those rocks, and actually ended up highlighting some of the detail using curvature masking. I think I also used a little bit of dirt masking as well, which is a nice generator for a basic kind of detail, just to get a little bit more of a specific crunch towards some certain details within your mesh. But yeah, I think they turned out quite alright as rocks. They weren't too hard to make, as all I had to do was highlight those mesh details that were already in it. And once I did that, I made sure to just simply get the right type of texture density throughout each one of the bits, because all of those rocks were in separate meshes, and again, we just had to make sure that the consistency throughout this work is being kept more or less the same. And to continue working on this asset, I went on and just simply masked out all the other areas for the other part of the town. This time I went in to texture the bridge as well as the roof parts, and I was getting faster at masking out some areas within this piece. As the more you work on it, you just have a tendency to pick up certain things. So for example, for the roofs, I ended up just positioning my camera and just crossing it with making a box selection that goes across it, and then deselecting the frames that were selected alongside it. So yeah, once I was done with the masking, I ended up just getting some of the texturing done for icicles as well, and I had a real nice stylized crystal, kind of a small material that I actually did for a Minecraft themed video. If you're interested in how I made that smart material, then make sure to check that out, where we had a really nice small miniature cave setup of our 3D environment. The main thing that it uses is a thickness map as well as a gradient, just to make sure it highlights some of those areas within those icicles. And I just changed up some of the colors and made sure it looks quite nice. In the end though, I did come back to it a little bit and just played around with some values a little bit more, because it's really hard to tell how it's gonna look like within Unreal Engine, since within Unreal Engine I'm planning to use some refraction values and make the mesh transparent, and it's just going to blend in differently with the overall kind of a design for this scene. So just have to make sure that the overall color variance is set properly. And anyway, once I was happy with that, I ended up just playing around with the overall texture design for the scene, and I realized that the roofs don't quite stand out as much. Although I'm planning to add some snow in the end, they still didn't look quite as well, so I ended up just darkening the overall colors. And again, I had to go in and mask each of the planks individually, and yeah, I was just getting a little bit faster, but it was still quite a hassle to do the overall steps. But during this process, you're able to kind of notice certain details. Like for example, for the watchtowers, it didn't quite stand out as well when they just had a completely wooden look. So what I ended up doing is, for the tips of the towers, I ended up just making them metal, and that just made them look a little bit more interesting, as I think the overall design looked just straight up better. But yeah, going back to the watermill, because I didn't quite like the completely wooden look, I ended up just changing the wheel to be a pure metal. Again, just to make sure it stands out a little bit more within the scene, since none of the materials that we're using have high saturation, as we want to make sure that the overall environment still has that bit of a gritty look towards it. So we had to make sure it stands out a little bit more within the scene by just playing around with certain values and switching around certain materials, so some of the meshes and their silhouettes would stand out a little bit more with. But yeah, once I was happy with the overall design, I wanted to add some snow. So in order to do that, I ended up just using for the masking something called light generator, and I just positioned the light source to be right above our environment, which in turn masks out everything that is on the top in a white kind of a mask, and that allows us to apply the snow that we had previously used within our terrain. But just using a light by itself wouldn't look quite well, so what I ended up doing is I ended up highlighting some of the crevices within this environment a little bit more using ambient occlusion, and that just made sure that the snow would pile up in areas where ambient mask is inverted. And also, not only that, I had to make sure that the snow mask breaks apart nicely, so I used an overlay of clouds and kind of made sure that instead of just having it a smooth transition, it would have a sort of a chunky type of a snow that ends up easing off from the overall mesh. Before doing all of these processes though, I was actually initially thinking of using a snow within Unreal Engine itself and just sorting out the gradient type. But in turn, that wouldn't give us a lot of control over the texturing process. As right now, for example, I'm using a paint brush and just kind of masking out some of the details where I don't want the snow to go. So for example, underneath the bridge, obviously because the snow wouldn't be falling down there, you have to make sure you mask it out a little bit just to make it look more believable. Also, to highlight some of the detail, I ended up painting out some of the walls just to make sure it doesn't just kind of bleed in with all of the wall meshes. And that in turn just brings out, I feel like it brings out the entire building as a whole a little bit more. So I quite like the way it turned out. Because of course, even if we set up our generated mask perfectly, it's still not going to give us amazing type of results. We also have to make sure we manually tweak some values and manually kind of paint in certain areas just to make the overall design look more believable. But in general, having generated masks for materials, like for the snow for example, just helps to speed up the overall process while texturing. And not only that, it also helps us to keep the consistency. So for example, the way the snow is being broken down on our meshes is being kept more or less the same for the roofs throughout the entire scene. So it just makes it look way more consistent in that regard. But yeah, after I was done applying all of the snow, and I was quite happy with the way it turned out, I ended up just making sure that the snow for the terrain is not being applied underneath the water, since obviously that would look quite silly. So I ended up just making sure I masked out all of the snow from where the water would go in. And although I had some water planes in Substance Painter just to visualize how it would look like, I'm not going to be texturing them here because we're going to be applying a custom material within Unreal Engine. But it's quite helpful to have these planes in here, not only just to visualize it, but actually also to get some ambient occlusion depth to our water later on, as this mesh will also be baked out within our mesh masks. So yeah, that's quite nice. After I exported everything out, when I was doing the Unreal Engine part and setting up the overall environment, you end up picking up some visuals that while doing the texturing process you wouldn't be able to do so. So basically I had to go back into the Substance Painter and readjust some of the values. Primarily the soil, as it looked way too light and it didn't give off the right kind of a silhouette. And also I went back to the icicles and I couldn't get them to look right as a simple type of ice. And what I realized that I don't have any type of snow on top of them. So I just ended up applying the smart material for the snow that I had and readjusting some of the values. But instead of using light transition to get only a directional kind of a mask from the top, I ended up changing that to a position masking and using that to cover snow on the top of the ice chunks that are going to be sitting on the water, as well as some of the icicle bits that are hanging from the ends of the cliffs. But yeah, once I was happy with that, then I ended up exporting everything out. I made sure that all of the texture maps are set up as 2K resolution, since they're so small and we actually used quite a lot of materials in total. The resolution looked quite well enough as is, and actually I did use a 4K resolution for the terrain because it did have only one texture map, and we have to make sure that we have more or less the same texture density throughout our project. Otherwise, if one area is, for example, too pixelated and another has a lot of resolution, it's just going to look quite a bit off. So yeah, once I was done with the overall texture process, I was now ready to take this scene into the Unreal Engine part. To start off building my environment within Unreal Engine 5, I ended up just creating myself a basic third-person template with a new map and importing my mesh within the content browser. It is a single FBX, but I just made sure I tick off the combined meshes together within the import menu just to make sure that all of them are separate, and I could adjust them if needed. And right away I placed it all within a world and just made sure that the location, the position of it all is just reset to a default. So all of it would be sitting in the center of the world. And then afterwards I imported all of the texture maps and made sure that the combined texture maps for the roughness, ambient occlusion and metallic has an sRGB ticked off. Otherwise, all of those channels wouldn't give us the right kind of results, or when we're using them as separate RGB channels. And once I've done that, I just created myself a basic PBR material that I was able to create material instance out of them and reassign all of the texture maps to the right material instances. I replaced all the original materials with the material references, and that just gave me all the right type of materials. So one by one, after I've done that, I just made sure that they're properly assigned and none of them have mismatched materials. And once I was happy with that, I just made sure I also do icicles as well. So right now I'm creating myself a basic refraction values that would give me the right kind of results for the ice, and I'm just making sure that they're set as translucent as well, just so we could get some nice depth out of them. And once I was happy with them, I just played around with the opacity value just to make sure that we get the right type of color out of them and they're not being too transparent. And once I did that, I ended up starting to create a water material for the overall project, and I really wanted to make sure that the water within this area is set up properly. So there was a lot of work involved within it, a lot of small detail that is being set up just right in order to make sure that the water has a nice flow as well as believable liquidy type of a form. So as a starting point, I had to make sure that my base material is set just right, and I created a single layer water material which doesn't actually use any of the translucency and kind of fakes it instead. And by using that, I was able to create some refraction custom values as well as absorption values, which, just to let you know, the absorption is what gets absorbed by the water the further down you go in the volume. So for example, because I set up an orange type of color as an absorption value, the further down you go in the water, the deeper you go, the more bluer of the water is going to get, which I think it turned out quite nicely. As it is quite a cold environment, we gotta make sure we have that nice bluish tint towards our water, just to make the overall design look a little bit more cold. And once I was done with that, I had to make sure we add some details to the very base of the water as well. So I ended up using some caustic texture map and just overlaying that within our texture map as well, just to fake some of the bottom detail within our mesh. But since again it is a simple single plane of a water material, we have to visually fake some of the detail, and also I had to make sure I have some control over the caustics, especially for the waterfall, since we don't want to have that caustic result towards the end of the water. So what I ended up doing is I ended up just getting a vertex color, and because by default the mesh didn't have enough vertices, I ended up just going into the modeling mode, getting myself the entire mesh to be remeshed with a higher count of vertices, and that allowed me to simply paste some of those vertices in and have some greater control of the effects for this type of water. Of course, once I was happy with that, and we needed some waves for the top of the water, I ended up getting myself a normal map of all the waves and just multiplying with one another. That also would include a pattern motion. By having two of them combined with different speeds, we'd get a type of an overlay that would just kind of avoid repetitive pattern. But once I was pretty much done with that, I just also made sure that I have some control within that material. And once I was happy with the overall control, I continued working on the water material and just making sure it looks more believable. So the next step was to make sure that the waterfall itself has some texture. So I ended up using a different type of a texture map that just pans downwards with the water, and just made sure that it is overlaid right next to the plane for the water as well. And with that plane, I just made sure that it is being faster than the water underneath, so it would give a different type of momentum look to this waterfall. It would make sure that the water itself would look like it's falling down. And again, just to make sure I blend in nicely with the overall kind of water, to make sure we avoid any of the kind of seams that we get from meshes from where they end, I made sure to also include vertex painting and use that within our opacity to hide away the seams. And once I was happy with that, we also had to make sure we add some of the different details for the water where they interact with objects. And the way I did it was I got myself a basic kind of a motion for the UV coordinates to just make sure that they kind of wobble back and forth a little bit, just to make sure that they would look like they're actually interacting with the water material itself. And once I got that, I think for this bit I used a material where it has 4 different types of variations within itself, just to give us those kind of water effects next to objects. And after I was done setting up the material, I ended up just getting all of these variations and then set them up right next to the objects, just to give them a certain effect that they're actually interacting with an asset. But once I was happy with that, I realized that for the pillars it's not going to be enough, so I ended up just going into Photoshop, getting myself some quick brushes, a couple of variations of them as well, and actually used a liquify filter just to kind of stretch them out a little bit, which in turn it turned out quite well, as we get a sort of a foam look towards the top section of the water or where the pillars interact. I also made sure that the variations would include a wider type as well, since I believe I used the same type of a texture where it just stretches out on the side of one of the icicles as well, especially the one where it's closest to the edge of a waterfall. And yeah, once I was basically done setting them up in pretty much the same manner as I did for the other texture maps that are next to the icicles, I basically placed them next to the pillars and just made sure they have a nice type of strength for the type of water wobble that is underneath, and also the speed is set up properly as well, just to make sure that again they're kind of more or less synced up with the overall motion that the water has, so it wouldn't look like it's a different type of an asset, and instead it would look like it's part of the same water material. When working with a water material, you gotta make sure that all of it is aligned properly. And it was quite difficult for me to get some planes to go near the water, near the edge of those waterfalls. So I ended up just getting into the modeling mode, using the formation and kind of setting them up in the right way, just so it makes sure that none of the gaps are left over. But I didn't worry about it too much, since most of the camera shots would be from a top-down view, so they weren't much of an issue. All I had to make sure was that they have the right type of motion for when the water is passing through them. And yeah, although they're stationary objects, that bit of a wobble definitely helps out in selling the entire kind of animation for the overall volume of the water. And after I was up with that, I also had to make sure that I have some of the detail that are placed next to the other areas as well. For example, like next to the fishing location. I ended up actually, to amplify that effect, I ended up just overlaying those meshes a little bit one with another and just making sure that they're set up properly. And the next step was I had to make sure that I have some of the detail for where the water ripple would be, for example, where the watermill is going and as well as the waterfall is being applied. So I actually had a really nice texture that I wanted to make use out of, but I had to make sure I bend it in a certain way. So to start it off, I began experimenting a little bit with the projection mode, and I actually figured that I could make use out of the cylindrical kind of projection just to kind of bend the overall texture to the way I wanted around my UVs. But that didn't work out, so I ended up just moving on and continuing with the overall kind of ripple effect. I wanted to start on by getting the basics out of the way first, so I ended up just getting a ripple effect using a sine and gradient masking, and that gave us a really nice type of a look towards them. Of course, by default they would just be applying a certain color, and that wouldn't give us the right type of results. So what we need to do is we need to kind of convert them into a normal map, and by using a lerp value and having a completely blue value as well as the opposite of that, we're able to kind of mix those two together and get the right type of results. So even in this case, when we have the normal applied, even if we were to turn off the masking for the base color, we still get some nice results out of the normal maps. But of course, since this is still a stylized scene, I kind of wanted to exaggerate some of those details. And so in turn, I just ended up kind of slightly using a white type of a color with a minimal amount of opacity set to it. And that in turn just gave me a really nice result. But during this process, I didn't quite like the way the edges were kind of being cut off, so I ended up just getting another radial gradient and just kind of applying that to the edges by inverting the overall mask and subtracting it from the ripple effect. So once I was happy with the material, I just had to make sure I play around a little bit with the values and get the right type of density that I want for the water effect. I just had to make sure that they're not overly used and set to the right kind of amount to blend in well with the overall flow of the water. And yeah, once I was happy with that, I then kind of realized that in order for me to bend this texture, I can use a warping and deformation and kind of bend it in the way that I want. But I was quite struggling at the very start because I didn't realize how difficult it would be to use modeling mode and deform the entire texture the way I wanted it to be. Since it wasn't going the right kind of way, at first I tried to change the position, the overall pivot point of the mesh, and just make sure it would kind of give me the right results, but it didn't quite work as well. So the default values didn't give me the right kind of results, even if I turned the bend mode all the way to 360. So I kind of had to make sure I bend it just the right amount just by playing around with the values and getting the type of ring that I want. Looking back at it though, I should have just used Photoshop and just got myself a nice texture, since I actually use this overall material within a particle mode, within a particle system, and I only just scaled it up a little bit just to get that sort of a motion of a ripple effect. So yeah, that might have worked way better, but it took so long to make this. I felt like I couldn't give up in the end. I just had to make sure I get it the way I wanted it to be. I didn't even think about the alternatives, so that was a mistake on my end, as it made the process just a little bit longer in the end. But all in all, I did end up getting the right kind of mesh with the right kind of bend for my UV coordinates, which I was then able to connect it onto my texture map and get the right kind of ripple. And once I was happy with that, of course, we had to go into the particle mode, as it allows us to get so many different variations of animated type of a mesh. Previously I didn't use it because it didn't feel like I was getting the more consistent kind of results. But in this case, I wanted to kind of get randomized type of motion using my alpha texture map. And during this process, I realized that I had to adjust the pivot point a little bit so the entire mesh would be centered in the right kind of position. But yeah, I just basically replaced the sprite with a mesh renderer. And actually, one thing that I will say about this, when I was changing the scale, I didn't get the mesh to be rendered, and I looked through for the solutions on the internet, and what I found was that by selecting the entire particle and then just going into the search bar, searching for mesh and getting our mesh scale to be uniform instead of non-assigned, you'll then be able to make use out of the scale mesh size, and it won't turn your particle system to be invisible. So I'm not sure why that is the case. That it is quite annoying. I usually just end up using 2D sprites when I'm working with particles, so I don't have much experience with those kind of problems. But once I got it set to working, I was able to then adjust the overall particle system in more or less the same kind of way that you'd be able to adjust a two-dimensional particle system as well. And once I was happy with the overall kind of a speed that I was getting out of the motion and the size and scale, I pretty much placed them next to the watermill as well as the waterfall that I was having next to my main body water. And I realized that I didn't have the material for the water to be set up within that area, so I had to make sure I create a new material instance for that water as well and set it up in the right kind of way. And by that I mean we had to make sure that the motion, which is pretty much the most important thing when we're setting up the water, is set up properly, otherwise they wouldn't look right. And yeah, once you set it up, the overall kind of a feeling of the water properly, you're pretty much good to go. And I also set up that the normal opacity would also be controlled with the vertex painting, and this way I was able to control where the normals are visible. So for example, next to the watermill, because we already have so many effects of the rippling kind of look, we had to make sure we remove the opacity from it, otherwise the water would lose all its momentum look from it. And once I did that, I just played around a little bit and I was pretty much done with the water. So the next step was to set up the water mill to be running, to actually have some animation. And before doing that, I realized that the mesh itself for the water mill and the water wheel is set as a one mesh. So I tried using modeling mode at the very start and get it separated, but in the end I just ended up feeling that it'd be way faster just to get a different FBX file and setting up our watermill building as well as the wheel to be completely separate meshes. One thing that I did have to change though was the pivot point. I had to make sure that it is at the very center of our asset for the watermill, otherwise the rotation wouldn't work. And once I was happy with that, I ended up just going into the blueprint and setting up a simple timeline that has a nice loop and just making use out of the rotation functionality and just giving it some rotation. At the very start though, I tried using it as a set rotation, which of course wouldn't work because we need to be constantly adding rotation in order to give that spinning motion. So yeah, just make sure you use add rotation node instead of set rotation node whenever you want to make this kind of a motion. And then afterwards, once I was happy with that, I just played around a little bit more with some extra settings. I realized that we need to add a little bit more to the water as it doesn't look quite good just yet. So we need to add some water splashes as a particles. And so I got myself some basic plane for the particle sheet that has a different type of splashes throughout its texture. It wouldn't matter which way you rotate it, it would always look like it's splashing in different directions. And that is exactly what we want for this kind of a particle system, because I ended up just using random rotation, and in turn it would give me a type of a motion that would be a little bit more randomized. And after I was happy with that, I just had to make sure that the motion itself is set up quite nicely. So I ended up using a point force that would end up just spewing those particles out. And of course, because we're setting up the waterfall as well, I set up a different particle system that uses more or less the same functionality and that just gets a different spawn point where they spawn. And I set those up to be basically spawning particles throughout the entire side of the waterfall. And I think that definitely just broke up the entire kind of a mesh. I also ended up just stretching out the entire waterfall just a little bit lower so we could break apart the overall silhouette of this environment. I think it turned out way nicer in that regard. And yeah, once I was happy with that, I just ended up making some couple extra tweaks, setting up the way I want the environment. And I realized that I needed some snow. I wanted to make this entire area snowy. And of course, the environment would look much better if there would be actually some snow. And by default though, the particle itself was too smooth looking. I wanted to keep that gritty type of look, also some depth. So I ended up just using kind of a noise node and just multiplying with a basic radial gradient just to get some additional noise out of these snow particles. And I just ended up creating a simple particle system which gives us a snow falling down onto our scene. And I think that just ends up looking really nice in the end, as that extra touch just makes the scene stand out a little bit more as an environment. So make sure whenever you're working with those kind of scenes, just think about the small detail and how to present your work. Even if it takes a while to set up, it definitely makes it look better overall. And yeah, once I was happy with that, of course we had to play around with the post-process effects, make the overall aesthetic look like it's within a cold scene. So it's quite actually easy to do. I just ended up lowering the temperature and playing a little bit with the saturation, making sure that some of that tint is being taken down a little bit. I think it turned out quite alright. And of course, as I said before, we had to make the waterfall longer. I also used modeling mode, and because the texture is using UV coordinates, I had to make sure I not overdo them, otherwise they would just stretch out all of the texture maps, and we don't want this to happen. So I was really careful when I was doing that. And yeah, once I was happy with that, I got myself a quick screenshot of the overall scene, and then just basically started playing around with the cameras. So the way I usually do with the cameras is I got myself a nice pivot point that I'm able to work with. Usually it's either an empty actor or an object that is set as invisible within a game mode, and then I can use that to just rotate it around and just have my camera to be focused whenever I want it to be. We can always use that also in the way that the camera would always be looking towards it, which we can easily set up within the cinematic camera properties tab. I didn't end up using that because there was no need within any one of my shots, but once I was pretty much set with my camera, I just ended up placing them in the way I want them within my level sequencer. So for starters, of course, we gotta get a nice close-up shot just so the entire environment would be nicely appreciated, even if you're watching it from a mobile phone, for example. And then the next shot, we have to make sure that the overall environment is seen through multiple angles. So the easiest way to do that is obviously a turntable. So again, setting that up is quite easy. Just have to make sure that the pivot position is set in the middle. So what I end up doing is usually getting myself a cylinder, then making it so large that it would encompass the entire scene, basically positioning it in a way that none of the edges would be overlapping, and this way wherever the center point of that cylinder is where the center of that level would be. So having a nicely centered pivot point within that exact spot is quite nice whenever you have a turntable and you got to make sure that the entire environment is set within the very center of your camera shot. Of course, you can't get it perfectly, especially if you have a disproportional kind of rocks. So for example, whenever you have a turntable rotating to the back, you'd see a lot of empty space, but that's usually unavoidable whenever you have a lot of unique shape towards your 3D kind of environment. But yeah, once I did that, I ended up just getting some of the extra close-up shots, just highlighting some of the detail within the environment, making sure that the overall kind of a composition is nice for whenever we have some motion. And once I was happy with that, I had to reset my engine to get myself a movie renderer queue. And I actually have myself a preset settings that I always import, and basically I render everything out within image sequence, which for each camera shot they're placed in separate folders, and then I'm able to put everything together when editing a video. So I left all of the things to render, and just when I thought they're done, I realized that I haven't finished it completely. I still had some trees to place it within my scene. And that's what usually happens. You end up getting a tunnel vision when you're focused to complete your work and you don't notice certain things. So yeah, after leaving my stuff to render and coming back the next day to check on the progress for my renders, I had a look at my work and I realized that the trees are missing. So yeah, in order to fix that, I actually got those trees from my different project, which you can also check within our YouTube channel. from a small forest environment that we did, and I just ended up adding them up onto the project. And of course, they didn't have any of the snow with them, so I ended up just getting myself a material blend that blends in the same snow material that I used for Substance Painter with the mesh textures, and it just used position normals to kind of cover the top sections of the tree, and that just gave us some nice results overall. So yeah, after I applied that kind of a texture onto the trees, I ended up just making sure I get some nice results. Since I had to re-render all of the environment, I just ended up having a quick glance on how the renders turned out, and I didn't like the overall solid color that I had, so ended up just quickly fixing that up by getting a nice plane underneath, getting an exponential fog, and kind of playing around with the values, and this way it gave me a nice transition from a light color to a darker color when it reaches the top. So yeah, overall, once I was happy with that, I just ended up re-rendering out all of my camera shots to get some nice results for the environment. Now that we're finished with it all, let's go ahead and review the entire process. The 3D modeling part, although had some technical difficult parts, for sure, overall it wasn't that difficult. Total time taken for modeling was around 8 hours, which with a lot of this being down to working with the terrain. The difficulty came in creating a large scene in a shorter amount of time. I think it's important, if you intend to create a scene like this, really think about how much work the textures will do for you. Start by doing as we did in the guide and create a small gray box and then a terrain. This will make the whole project a lot easier to put together. Next, create modular pieces that you can change with little work but still look varied. Other parts of the model was to ensure that the actual structures look believable, and we had to make sure they look secure and structurally sound. When doing a similar project, be sure to do a lot of referencing into the building built on the edges of the cliffs or things like dams. Finally, the rope was done with a small GeoNode setup, which is quite simple to put together, but does need a little blender knowledge. All in all, I'm giving this build a 5 out of 10 for modeling, so it might be a good project for beginners really wanting to push their skills. It just may be a little too big of a project for the most. The texturing part took 2 hours and 52 minutes to get the environment painted. As we started to texture out our scene, there were a lot of individual assets that needed to be masked out to get the right type of texture. Not only that, after getting the base texturing work done, we also had to set up the overlay texture for the snow to apply onto our whole level. When working with a snowy, gritty levels, we have to make sure that we keep the saturation down to a minimum, as most of the items would be frosted over from the cold. This sometimes makes it difficult to highlight certain structures within our 3D artwork, but by hand painting certain detail out, we can keep the desired results with a greater control. At a quick glance, you might think that working on a snow environment might make it easier, as all you need to do is cover everything in snow. But working with such environments can be quite a challenge in order to get the assets not to blend in with one another. Another part to point out was texturing icicles. Although I had used a Smart Material preset, I had to do a lot of tweaking to get the right results without actually knowing how the final results will turn out at the start, as I knew that I'll be setting it up within Unreal Engine with refraction values, and in Substance Painter we can't get that type of preview other than setting up a basic transparency setup. So all in all, I will give this one a 7 out of 10 in regards to the difficulty to texture, as the main focus of this in order to get good results was setting up good looking grain for the wood, to texture the houses, and to make sure we control the snow layers. The environment took 5 hours and 10 minutes, as we had to create a water material from scratch to get the water looking just right. To get the water looking nice within the scene, there's a lot of smaller pieces that needs combining in order to get the right type of results. To create it, you need knowledge in material editing, particle systems, amongst many other things, so it might be quite a hard thing to do. As it was the center point of our environment, we couldn't just use basic tricks to hide a simple plane of water within our terrain. We had to make sure it is set up just right, with the right type of flow, and it interacts with our environment visually. Other than that, we had to set up our watermill animation, which was done through a simple blueprint code, but it worked quite well in bringing our scene to life. All in all, it was quite a lot of work to set it all up, as I want to make sure that we're getting that cold, airy environment whilst making sure it wasn't just looking like a completely stationary object. So I'm giving this one an 8 out of 10 in regards to difficulty, as I think a beginner in this section would definitely feel a little overwhelmed whilst trying to present its piece. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed our little venture through our Snow Fjord scene environment. Make sure to give us a like if you did, and don't forget to drop a comment down below of what you would like to see us do next. Check out our links down below to see a massive library of our courses we have available, which are free to anyone that signs up to our Patreon. We also just completed an online course focusing on creating a modular dungeon scene using Kitbash assets, so make sure to check it out as I'm really excited about it and I'm certain that you'd love it as well. We also have some free goods on our Gumroad, things like texture packs and some models for anyone to download. And that'll be all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.